Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we're diving back into our series dedicated to classic Chinese comfort foods with yet another shot at what I can confidently call my favorite noodle dish of all time, which is a Sichuan sesame noodle or doubanjiang. Now, for those who have been following along, the list of sesame noodles that we have done on this channel has become quite extensive at this point. Early on in the series, we also did a peanut butter-based dandan noodle which used dry fettuccine, and more recently we also did a fried shallot vegetarian version as well. One thing that has always nagged me though is that we have not yet done a really traditional version of this dish, which in my opinion has a whole bunch of really interesting and unique qualities to the way that it's assembled and plated that I think are worth taking a closer look at. So for our version today, we're going to start off with a few pantry essentials that you might expect, like shaoxing wine, doubanjiang, and dark soy sauce. But then we're also going to take a closer look at the element that I think makes or breaks this whole dish, which is our chili oil. Today we're going to be making ours from scratch to really bring this dish to life, but those that have been following along know that we often use the lao gan ma version of this ingredient literally all the time, which makes this chili oil really versatile. Finally, I would be remiss if we didn't address my personal favorite twist to a dandan mian, which is that here in the States, dandan noodles are often made with peanut butter. So we'll be taking a closer look at the differences between what is sesame paste, tahini, and of course, good old Skippy's peanut butter. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so diving right in, we're starting off over on the stove because we're getting to our chili oil as early as possible in our cook today. Going into my saucepan here is a single cup of neutral oil. I'm using grapeseed, but canola or vegetable oil will also work as well. Then I'm moving this into a smaller saucepan, not sure why I picked such a large one. And then I'm adding some whole dry spices to simmer on low heat for 10 minutes. Today that's going to be some cinnamon stick, Szechuan peppercorn, dried Tianjin peppers, and star anise. For those keeping track though, what we're actually using here are any or all of the spices commonly found in Chinese 5-spice, which is of course not limited to 5 spices. So for those looking to sub, other common spices might include things like clove, fennel seed, ginger, nutmeg, cardamom, or licorice too. 10 minutes later, as you might notice, our spices have become quite toasty, so I'm killing the heat and fishing these out, leaving behind this wonderfully aromatic and infused oil. Then next, now that we're off heat, I'm adding a 1/4 cup of red chili flake to steep in our residual heat. Ooh, yeah, that's the stuff. The longer that this steeps, the more infused that chili flake will become here. Mine steeped for about an hour before serving, which was lovely enough, but later on I went to jar this up and used this oil for the next few weeks, and by the end of the jar we were left with a wonderfully red, deeply aromatic and fragrant chili oil. So while we might just be using a few spoonfuls of this today, my recommendation is to jar this up and save it for literally everything that you eat for the next couple of weeks. Moving on to our veggie elements next, I'm diving into my aromatic veggies here first. This is 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, followed by 1 inch or about 1 tablespoon of finely minced ginger, and the whites of 3 green onions sliced thinly. Then I'm taking these reserved leafy greens and slicing them up thinly on a bias for our finishing garnish later on as well. Diving into our sauce next, you will notice that we have 2 different sauce elements going on today, which is a big part of how a dandan mian is meant to be plated. More on that in a moment. The first here is our sesame sauce, which as you might guess is going to be the highlight of the evening today. This is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce and a single tablespoon of shaoxing wine going in here first, followed by 2 tablespoons of brown sugar and a single tablespoon of doubanjiang to round out but not overwhelm the heat from our chili oil coming up. Then next going in here is 3 tablespoons of peanut butter. Now, for those staying super traditional, what you should be using is Chinese sesame paste, which is made from toasted sesame seed, which also gives it a nice aromatic quality. Alternatively, you could also use the Mediterranean tahini, which is sesame paste made from untoasted sesame, or if you're like me and you have a soft spot for weird Americanized Chinese cuisine, there's just something about a doubanjiang made from Skippy's peanut butter that just can't be beaten. Call it nostalgia, call it blasphemy, either way, if you've never done this dish with peanut butter, you're missing out on one of life's greatest pleasures. Anyway, I'm adding just a touch of water here to help loosen up that peanut butter. Then I'm rounding out my sauce with, yes, that was 6 tablespoons of chili oil, and yes, for those wondering, that was too much chili oil. This stuff is righteously spicy, more so than the jarred stuff off the shelf, so adjust accordingly for yourselves here. Moving on to our second marinade sauce, this is the second sauce which we'll be pairing with our ground pork today. We do still want the focus here to be on our peanut sauce though, so we're going to keep our marinade fairly simple with just enough kick to give our ground pork some nice independence. Going in here first is another 4 tablespoons of soy sauce and 1 tablespoon of sesame oil to start, followed by a single tablespoon of shaoxing wine and dark soy sauce. Rounding this out is 2 tablespoons of hoisin sauce to add a bit of sugar to our marinade, then I'm mixing this all up to combine and we're heading over to the stove. Over on the stove, I have my wok heating up on medium-low heat so that we may start off with a toast to our Sichuan peppercorn here. I'm adding this to a dry wok, then letting it toast for 2 to 3 minutes with some constant agitation until it becomes nice and fragrant. Then I'm removing our peppercorn to a mortar and pestle and giving it a crush until a fine powder forms. We're also going to be passing this through a sieve later on to filter out these larger flakes, so don't worry if you see a lot of those floating around. Next up, back over on the stove, I have a pot of water at a rolling boil. Then I'm adding in 16 ounces or 1 pound of fresh Chinese egg noodles going in for a quick 2-minute cook. I'm reserving about a half cup of pasta water here, more on this in a moment, then removing my noodles from heat and immediately shocking these in cold water to halt our cooking process. Then back over on the stove, I finally have my wok heated up as hot as possible. Then I'm adding 4 tablespoons of peanut oil and, as always, long yao for that nice non-stick surface. Then going in here first, as promised, are my aromatic veggies. Here's my garlic, ginger, and the whites of my green onions going in. I'm blooming these for about 15 seconds until nice and fragrant, then following up with my ground pork next. We're switching to an overhand grip here to break up these larger clumps of pork until a nice pebbly texture is left behind and our pork is about 80% cooked through. Then I'm following up with my marinade sauce next, giving this a toss for about 1 to 2 minutes before removing once our pork is fully cooked through. Now, for those following along, the next 2 things that we're about to do come strictly from European cooking, so if you want to keep your doubanjiang super traditional, just skip this step entirely. But for what it's worth, I genuinely have no idea why neither of these 2 things come up in Chinese cooking because they're really useful. First up, I'm adding my peanut sauce to the wok here so that we may deglaze all of this wonderful fond left behind in the wok. All of that glorious pork fat left behind should not go to waste here. Then next going in here is my reserved pasta water, about a 1/4 cup or so that we may thicken up our sauce with the starch left behind in the pasta water. Once again, the reservation of pasta water is also not a technique that happens in Asian cooking. I imagine it has something to do with the way that sauces are more commonly thickened up with cornstarch, or maybe it's just one of those grandma things that never properly passed down. Either way, what we do know is that both of these techniques work really well, so, let's stop gatekeeping doubanjiang. Anyway, 2 to 3 minutes later, our sauce should be nice and combined with all of this wonderful fond, and then thickened up from our pasta water as well. Then finally back over on our cutting board. Now a doubanjiang is traditionally plated in 3 separate layers, first starting off with our peanut sauce on the bottom. Then going on top of that is our noodles next, followed by my ground pork on top of that, then our reserved greens of our green onions to finish. Then finally, I'm finishing this all off with my toasted Szechuan peppercorn passed through a fine mesh sieve, and we're ready to eat. Okay, so I know that I promised a super traditional doubanjiang today, and I also know that we deviated just a tiny bit with a few Eurocentric cooking techniques here as well, but for what it's worth, I also think what we ended up with here is still a super traditionally done doubanjiang, and more importantly, holy Jesus fucking is this good. Our peanut sauce is deeply rich with umami and heat coming from our chili oil, with a wonderfully creamy texture from our peanut butter as well. Then our ground pork has a nice independence to it from our marinade that makes it flavorful but not overpowering and works well as a nice complement to our peanut sauce without getting in the way too much. Then finally, our toasted Szechuan peppercorn is a wonderfully fragrant finish for a nice traditional and iconic touch to such a classic Szechuan dish. Lastly, there's also just something very nostalgic about the way that this dish is plated for me with its sauce elements at the very bottom. It just feels like a nice nod to the Szechuan street food roots of this dish with its bare noodles sitting out for the world to see. It also reminds me of how my grandma used to plate her spaghetti, which was absolutely inspired by dan noodles like this one too. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. For those who are new to the channel, this one is part of a larger series that we've been doing that's dedicated to classic Chinese comfort food dishes, so definitely check out that series next if you haven't yet because there's a lot of these. For the Bay Area locals, the Wu Can Cook fried rice pop-up is back at Oakland First Friday tonight, so come by and say hi if you can. More about that at wucancook.com/eats. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice interneters, and I'll see you soon. Bye.